Hello, my name is Aomawa Shields, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of California at Irvine. And I've been invited to talk with you about the role of surface composition in climate and habitability studies of exoplanets. We are living in a whole new universe now, where once it was believed that the Earth was the only planet capable of supporting life. We now know of dozens of planets that might fit that bill. And typically when we simulate their climates using a hierarchy of different types of models, we assume that the planets are covered in ocean, that they're aquaplanets, whether that's 50-meter deep slab ocean planets or 4,000-meter fully circulating ocean planets. However, there's a whole lot of different surface compositions that might be possible beyond simply ocean, including water ice, salty ice, and land. And the light from the star is going to interact differently with the planet's surface, depending on the composition of that surface. So if nothing else, please take away from this talk that surface composition matters when we're going about simulating the climates and possible habitability regimes of these planets. And that's the method for obtaining the most accurate assessments of these planets' habitability, incorporating all of the different parameters that we think might be super critical to their habitability, and surface composition is one of those parameters. So let's talk about starlight. We all know that the distribution of spectral energy is different for stars of different spectral types. But stars aren't the only aspect of the stellar planetary environment that exhibit wavelength-dependent properties. Climatic feedbacks on a planet also exhibit wavelength-dependent properties. For example, ice albedo feedback. Water ice has a particular property where it's extremely absorptive of longer, redder wavelength light and reflective of bluer, shorter light. So looking at albedo as a function of wavelength for ice of different grain sizes, ranging from the finest grained ice, which is snow, down to coarse grained blue marine ice. You can see both of those in this photo. Here we also include a land spectrum that's representative and a very flat ocean spectrum. What we see is that ice on a planet orbiting a star like the sun is going to reflect most of the light that hits it, because ice reflects strongly where the sun emits strongly. Whereas ice on a cooler, redder ice on a planet orbiting a cooler, redder M-dwarf star is going to absorb most of the light that hits it, because ice absorbs strongly where M-dwarfs emit strongly. And so understanding this phenomenon has led to being able to apply it to climate and habitability studies. And we've done that using a couple of different models, 1D energy balance models, EBMs, as well as the more sophisticated 3D global climate models, GCMs. You'll be learning more about the difference between these models in other talks, but the way to specify surface albedo in these models is a little bit different depending on the model that you're using. So usually in the EBM, you input a broadband albedo for your surface type. So you're integrating across the entire EM spectrum for that surface albedo spectrum. With a GCM, you might be able to obtain greater resolution, typically like a 2-band albedo, for example, visible and IR albedos where the cut happens at about 0.7 microns. You're always weighting by the host star spectrum. And with an EBM, you'll need to have a separate radiative transfer model to allow you to incorporate the full atmosphere of the planet into the broadband planetary albedo calculation. Whereas the GCM, you're specifying the atmospheric composition internally to the GCM, so you don't need another model on top of it. So we've been able to apply this spectral dependence of ice albedo feedback to answer questions about snowball episode entrance and exit requirements. So how likely certain planets are to experience snowball states and how they're able to get out of them when they do. So we've been able to identify that M-dwarf planets require larger decreases in installation to freeze and smaller increases in installation to thaw compared to planets orbiting G or F dwarf stars. We also identify that M-dwarf planets, when they do thaw with a shorter jump in ice line latitude, whereas the hotter and brighter the star, the higher the jump in ice line. And an interesting thought experiment is which of these scenarios is better for life. We've also been able to apply our understanding of this surface albedo feedback to answer other questions about the climate system of an exoplanet, like how is its partitioning, the partitioning of its global energy budget, how is it affected by the host star's spectrum? Things like what we've done for the Earth, partitioning its global energy budget, measuring and calculating how the incident energy from a star flows and cycles through a planet's atmosphere and surface, what we call Trenberth diagrams when we depict this information graphically. We've been able to do that for planets orbiting different types of stars in recent work, even identifying that M-dwarf planets require less installation to get to a planet similar to modern day Earth with a 288 degree Kelvin global mean surface temperature, whereas F-dwarf planets require higher installations because in large part of this surface albedo process, the ice albedo feedback, and also because of the difference in atmospheric absorption between the three planets' atmospheres. And you can read more about that study in a recent paper we have in APJ Letters. We've also been able to apply this knowledge to planets at all eccentricities. My grad student Igor Polupsky has quantified the fractional habitability for planets as a function of eccentricity and installation, allowing us to determine that even the most highly eccentric planets have some fraction of habitability during the course of their orbit, surface habitability. Another surface type that we've explored, particularly in the context of M-dwarf planet habitability, is sodium chloride dihydrate, also known as hydrohalite. This is basically ice with precipitated salt in it. And so here we're looking at a brine pocket in sea ice, and on the left you've got that the brine pocket's filled with liquid, and then this hydrohalite forms at temperatures below minus 23 degrees Celsius. This picture was taken at minus 28.7 degrees Celsius, 15 minutes apart. So 15 minutes later, we have the picture on the right where the sodium chloride has precipitated and filled the brine pocket and with crystals that block the light. And so if we look at hydrohalite on the similar albedo wavelength plot, we see that in the region of the spectrum where M-dwarfs emit strongly, hydrohalite, unlike salt-free water ice, becomes extremely reflective at longer wavelengths. And so we've explored the implications of this difference between types of ices that could be possible on climate and habitability. And so when we run control experiments versus experiments where we incorporate an albedo parameterization for the formation of hydrohalite into our GCM, we find that there are clear differences. And so particularly for lower installation planets in the tropics where there's net evaporation present, we see a much bigger difference between the control case and the case where we do have a parameterization there. But even for M-dwarfs receiving 65% of what Earth gets from the sun, so still clearly in their host star's habitable zones, the differences start to become non-zero and non-negligible. And when we evaluate synchronously rotating M-dwarf planets, we find that they're even more susceptible to the incorporation of an albedo parameterization for the formation of this type of surface type, hydrohalite. They get colder on their day sides, therefore they are more susceptible to the formation of the surface type. And so if we don't incorporate this parameterization for hydrohalite into our GCMs, we get a very different result and an inaccurate result of what their climates could actually be compared to when we do. And of course, there could be land on exoplanets. We would hope there would be. And as I said, land has its own spectrum. This was a representative kaolinite, which is a type of clay spectrum that we use, and it tends to be used in climate modeling studies. And when we see here that at longer wavelengths, land begins to be more reflective than ice, which is a super cool property. And my postdoc, Andrew Rushby, carried out a study looking at the percentage of land on a planet's surface and how that percentage can influence climate and habitability. And what we find is that the more land you have on the planet's surface, the colder your temperatures are as a result of your higher broadband planetary albedos. But M-dwarf planets are still warmer than their counterparts, orbiting hotter, brighter stars because of that ice albedo feedback effect, that spectral dependence. And then there are many other types of land compositions possible beyond kaolinite. And so we've actually explored this with specific applications to the TRAPPIST-1 planets. So we're showing different spectra up here, including the spectrum of TRAPPIST-1. On the bottom, we have a range of different land albedos spectra from calcite, very reflective, all the way down to granite. And we've determined that there's a difference of 50 Kelvin across these two end members, granite to calcite. And that has implications for the global mean surface temperature on these planets. That makes this temperature, 50 Kelvin difference is huge. And when we look at temperature, surface temperature more broadly across these planets, assuming synchronously rotating configurations, we find that the TRAPPIST-1d planet is the most capable of supporting life with this sort of low albedo surface, something like an igneous rock. And that greater amount of heat, absorption, energy on the lowest albedo surface planet, so assuming the lowest albedo surface like granite, ends up affecting what's going on in the atmosphere. We have a lot more cross-equatorial energy transport on these planets in the lower albedo case compared to the higher albedo case. So the takeaway points from this talk: surface composition affects the climate and habitability of exoplanets. We've seen this in our studies and determined that it's extremely important to incorporate the spectral dependence of the range of surface types possible on exoplanets into GCMs and other models. It's only through doing this that we'll be able to obtain the most accurate assessments of the possible climates and the potential habitability of planets as they are discovered. I'd like to thank my funding sources, the TIE Workshop Committee for the invitation to be with you, and the collaborators on these papers that have contributed to the work. Thank you all for your attention. Enjoy the workshop.